and welcome to Africafé, the broadcast that talks about African organization and issues. Today we're going to talk about the energy transition in Africa and its challenges. But before that, let's look at this issue.
Several systemic shocks affected the energy system in the past 3 years. Energy demand saw a historically large drop in 2020 due to pandemic-induced lockdowns, but sharply increased in 2021 after restrictions were eased. The Atlantic Basin presents itself as a key provider of energy for the global future, thanks to several innovations in unconventional, marine, and renewable energy. The EU needs to establish alliances with South Atlantic countries in order to take advantage of tremendous energy potential throughout the South Atlantic area and explore the dynamics and mutual interaction. Also, the energy transition has the potential to sustainably boost employment in the renewable energy sector in Africa, up from around 0.35 million in 2020 to over 4 million by 2030 and over 8 million by 2050. This is a 20-fold increase by 2050 from today's values, and 4 times as many jobs as without the energy transition. Many of the renewable energy jobs in Africa are in solar, bioenergy, wind, and hydropower.
Hello Sabrine, it's a pleasure to have you here today for this episode of Africafé. Today I want to talk about the energy transition and its implication in Africa. I want to talk about the state of the art and the challenges when it comes to financing and the different sources of renewable energy and their use in Africa. So my first question, and it's quite direct, maybe obvious, so our viewer can really understand what we're talking about. When we talk about renewable energy, can we really consider it as a reliable source for electrification and for the energy consumption of the African continent?
Thank you very much for having me, Youssef. The pleasure is mine, actually. So when we talk about reliability in terms of electricity production, I think that it's very important to assess what reliability means in this context. And one definition that I actually really like is the one provided by the US Department of Energy, and which sustains the following. Reliability means the system's components' ability to withstand cases of cascading failures, sudden shutdown, as well as instability, while its resilience, on the other hand, rather stands on actually the system's components being able to go back rapidly into a recovery state. So when we consider the African continent, we consider a continent that is abundant with differences and heterogeneity in terms of countries. Let's take, for example, South Africa. The energy mix in South Africa is highly reliant on coal, and this is actually not a surprise because South Africa actually has among the top 10 reserves in terms of coal in its country. And more than that, the South African economy is actually highly reliant on coal, which represents 75% of its primary energy source. And when you think of it, you think that actually having fossil fuels in your country is a burden in your path towards energy transition, and it makes you go slower. But when you don't have it, actually, it makes you more vulnerable in terms of external parties when you want to supply energy. Another example of that, for instance, is in 2021, when Algeria, our neighbors, decided to cut off natural gas supplies on Morocco due to lingering political tensions between both countries. And Morocco, in that context, had to go back to coal because coal remains a relatively cheap solution.
And reliable.
Exactly, and also technically feasible. So not only did we get back in our energy transition path, but we had to enter the international natural gas market in times of soaring prices due to the war in Ukraine.
Yes.
And so when you think about this, you just say that Morocco is highly dependent in terms of energy. And this is true. The dependency rate is around 90%, actually.
Yes.
But what we also should remember is that Morocco has a coastline of 3,500 kilometers, abundant with potential for renewable energy, especially in terms of solar and wind. And when you think of it, Morocco's ambition in terms of energy transition did not only start yesterday. Already in 2009, Morocco had the ambition of having, in terms of installed capacity, 42% of its electricity generated by renewable energy and 52% by 2030. Although we did not quite read the objectives fully, but when you think of it, in the year 2000, we had 0% of electricity produced thanks to renewable energy. In 2020, the share jumped to 15%, and if we count hydroelectricity, it actually jumps to 20%. Okay. So I think that eventually countries in general, and African countries, when they enter a path of energy transition, they start entering a virtuous cycle of price and technological competitiveness.
Yeah, so I think we should move towards renewable energy. There's a context that countries have to adapt to in order to keep the energy going and keep the energy consumption and the energy expenditure at a minimum level.
Yes.
You talked about solar and wind power, and obviously a lot of countries in the African continent are abundant with that and investing heavily in these two types of renewable energy sources, and we often talk about them. One that is not often talked about is hydropower, and like you said, Morocco has more than 3,500 kilometers of coastal lines, but we can talk also about countries like Guinea that has a lot of water, a lot of countries in West Africa, in the regions of the Great Lakes that have water and that can leverage this water to create electricity.
Exactly.
So my question to you is what is the state of hydropower in Africa, and how can it be used to further the energy transition in the continent?
Of course. So when we talk about hydropower, although it was not a very popular source up until today, but today there is a lot of success and a lot of hype around hydropower.
Okay.
And I think that it is completely attributable and very fair in terms of hydropower. So when you generate electricity with hydropower, you use one of the cleanest, if not the cleanest, sources of energy. And not only that, but it also allows you to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So when you compare it to energy produced from coal, hydropower allows you to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions up into 4 billion tons annually, which is amazing. Yeah. And it also sets the ground for other sources of energy, like wind and solar power as well, thanks to its flexibility and also its storage technicities. So hydropower, in a nutshell, is a very reliable source of energy, since we were talking about reliability earlier, and it's also a price competitive one. So when we talk about the African continent, according to the EIA, up to 17% on average of electricity in Africa is produced from hydropower. And while you could think that this rate is quite low, the expectation is that by 2040 the rate would jump up into 23%. But what is more interesting is that the rate is up to 80% in some countries, and I can give a few examples, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, such as Zambia as well, Uganda. A lot of countries are using their water resources for hydropower, which is really fascinating. And I think that Africa actually has the right resources in terms of perennial and non-perennial hydropower, which would need actually harnessing for socio-economic reasons. I'm afraid that the same cannot be said about Morocco, for instance, because hydropower is highly dependent on precipitation levels, and these levels are really highly volatile in Morocco.
Regions like the Sahel and Morocco has less precipitation and less water to harness to have hydropower.
Exactly. So when we look at the past numbers, for instance, in 2010 the share of hydropower in electricity production in Morocco was around 18%. In 2015 the share dropped to 15% and then jumped again to 18%
we don't
in
consider
2020.
Dams within hydropower?
Not really. So here we are just talking about hydropower contribution as in general in electrification. But the problem is the highly unreliability on due to precipitation level is also aggravating due to climate change.
All right.
Which makes it a little unreliable for Morocco. So if I could conclude for this question, I would say that hydropower is a really effective and price competitive solution when it is applied in the right places and in the right circumstances. But for Morocco, I think that a mix and diversification can be key, even in terms of renewable energy.
Yeah, sounds fair. I understand more about the implications of hydropower. And you've talked about price, and we first talked about reliability.
Yes.
When it comes to the energy transition, I think that countries don't escape the economical logic of cost and demand and market and being efficient. So when it comes to renewable energy, there's the question of reliability, but there's also the question of financing.
Exactly.
Because projects such as wind farms or solar power farms or huge areas of solar panels require a lot of financing.
Yes.
And this is what Africa often lacks. So my last question to you is, when it comes to wind and solar power, which are the most popular energy, renewable energy sources that are used today and being talked about, what is the state of the art when it comes to financing, and what are the challenges?
So as you mentioned, Youssef, especially in the initial costs for renewable energy such as wind and solar, they are very important. And when you think about it, in Africa, for instance, a lot is being done today. Although, as you mentioned, financing, incentives, as well as market barriers remain among the key obstacles in the world, but in Africa in particular. So when I talk about the initiatives that are being done in Africa, for instance, there is the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa. It is an initiative that was launched in around 2011 by the African Development Bank, and which actually already helped scale up two projects, one in the Democratic Republic of Congo and another one in Ethiopia, and in Burkina Faso, I'm sorry. And I think that the importance of these projects is not only that they help financing with the private sectors, help its energy transition projects, but it also gave a view and set the ground for blended energy initiatives in terms of renewable energy. So blended finance is very important in this context. Another example would also be the African Renewable Energy Fund, and this time it is a little different since it helps actually small projects in terms of hydro, biomass, geothermal, wind and power projects in sub-Saharan Africa, except for South Africa. In Morocco, actually, when you think of it, we have really large public institutions that are financing renewable energy projects. And one particular case that my co-author Afaf Zarkik and I talked about in a book, Atlantic Currents, is that for solar energy in Morocco, maybe, or actually, we kind of really think that having high reliance on public financing may have caused delays and also higher costs in terms of solar energy efficiency in Morocco. When you think of it, actually, yeah, because when you think only of permits, actually they cause a lot of delay, but they're also adding additional costs in terms of solar energy projects costs. And I finally think that as it was relayed by the Moroccan Minister of Energy Transition and Sustainable Development, private sector, international and national financial institutions should double their efforts if we're going to scale up efficient and long-term energy transition projects in Morocco. So in that end, I think that I do believe in blended finance, and that public sector as well as private sector could help tackling financing issues in terms of energy transition.
I think it's a great conclusion, because when it comes to African countries and the energy transition, we should harness the private sector, and we should always think about this question of economic profitability and economic soundness of those projects in order for them to be able to help the country and not just become something that's just going to hinder their development or put a debt into their budget.
Exactly. Yeah. I completely agree
Thank
with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Youssef. That's a pleasure.
To know more, you can go on our website, policycenter.ma, and see you soon for our next episode of Africafé.